All right. As we wait for folks to filter in, I've just pulled up the agenda. I had to remind myself because I think it feels like it's been a long couple of weeks. But as we return to the governance agenda, there's a couple topics that we've been starting to discuss in the early October calls that we wanted to return to. And then, so that would be notably like we had started talking about like alternatives to the way that we're modeling stub value sets today. I'll do a recap of that as well as a kind of here's where we left off. Talking about like any kind of findings that's come out of some of the other discussions, like in this space around like where do we essentially point our value sets bindings to regarding like pan-Canadian servers and THO. I was going to, and I'm glad Piers you were able to join. I think the last governance call, we had kind of discussed through a potential reslicing issue. I think it sounded like it was around fish and you were going to go back and investigate. And then I was looking through Mike's notes on the profiling call last week. And it sounds like the reslicing came up again. So I added it back to the agenda to just do an update if we had any kind of further things that investigation had returned. And then there's like I don't know if we'll get to it today, but in going through the baseline, one of the pages that we have right now is the all artifacts page, which breaks down like the profiles and then their level of maturity. And I think as we prepare for like the next major release, one of the things that we might do is look back through kind of our maturity level descriptions and just evaluate, if we should be increasing some from the levels of 0 or 1 that they are today. So may get to that today, may not get to that today, but we'll see. I definitely think it's something that is pressing for the next major release, which I think is what we're hoping to do early into the next year. Anything that you're not seeing on the agenda that you want to make sure that we chat through today? All right. Then I will just jump right into kind of a recap of where we sat with the stub value sets. So about 2 or 3 calls ago, we brought up the challenge that some folks were having with our current structure and like the structure in general of stub value sets, where when you have effectively when you're like publishing a skeleton of a value set under its existing canonical, but not providing any of the content, and some of that content also then lives in a package on someone's internal validation suite, that there sometimes arise conflicts. And so we started at the end of September, beginning of October, talking through like, oh, what are our options in our modeling that kind of like meet some of the same needs that we have, right? In terms of like both end user understandability and technical resolution, but that might resolve some of those challenges. And one of the ones that we thought was the most promising that we decided we wanted to take some sessions to go through and test was this option 1B, which was effectively like value set URLs matter less than code system URLs, in the sense that your project, you can publish a value set and you can point to somebody else's value set at a stable location using the compose.include value set element. At the time, we were like, well, this theoretically sounds like it should work for what we want to do, but we weren't actually sure whether or not the validation tools were capable of essentially like making the jumps that were necessary to like inspect what was provided here when doing an example validation and like making the call to find that value set that was nominated here and validating against it. And so the last governance call, we said, well, it sounds promising. We want to try it out. And we wanted to basically create a scenario that would actually allow us to validate for a terminology server that publisher could access. And we tried THO because it was the easiest at the time. Can we kind of force a scenario where we can evaluate whether or not this actually gets checked? And last time at the very end of the call, we were able, after kind of creating the scenario and we documented, okay, here's the steps that were like relevant. We were able to confirm that, and I'll show folks the example structures, refresh folks on those in a second here. We were able to confirm that when we created an example, that was intentionally supposed to fail the scenario we created, the validation suite that's part of IG Publisher picked up on that and successfully errored. And we said we were going to return to test the opposite, which would be like the positive. Can it pick up and not flag an error when the value that is provided in the example actually meets the scenario rules? And so I'll walk folks through. So both the setup, and then I'll just refresh folks on like what that error message looked like. And then we'll run it again with the additional example that we created that actually was supposed to meet the rules and see what the outcome is. So I think that's, yeah, this one. Okay. So a refresh on how we created the scenario, because I do think like this is important because not all of our bindings will work this way, but effectively we're trying to create as much of a controlled environment as possible to test whether or not the capabilities were there. So we created a test practitioner role profile, and we just said, okay, well, the only thing we care to really check is that we're going to set a binding towards this essentially pass-through value set that's a CA baseline, kind of like a new type of stub. It's a new type of pass-through that's here, and we're going to require the binding, meaning it's a hard error, it's a hard rule that will be checked against. And then when we created that pass-through value set, right, at this baseline canonical rather than at the original canonical, which is how we've been doing stub value sets to date, we said, okay, this value set is going to have this compose statement, and we're going to try out this compose include, and this is a value set that is loaded onto THO, the terminology server. So it was like, will it be able to check something that we know exists on THO that has the values loaded and like take the 2 steps required to validate an example against it? This is, let's see, this is the actual, we just randomly selected something that like was kind of close to rules, but was really just for the purpose of, it's a slim value set that was loaded. So this value set on THO right here is supposed to just have one code in it, NURS, right? That comes from this code system. So if our scenario is correct, if we supplied anything other than this, because of the way that we set up the scenario, it should flag an error. And so when we had our first example and we provided some, bogus code system and a code that doesn't actually match with what was expected, we expected an error. And that if an error showed up, it meant that it was highly likely the validation tools could leverage this structure of compose, include, and referencing another value set on a different server. And this is the example that we got. Or sorry, this is the validation on the example that we created, which didn't have the code that was expected. So we got back an error that basically says none of the codes that were provided are in this value set. So it did perform that check. And, basically is saying the code system and the code were incorrect. So we left off basically saying, well, we feel really good, but we ran out of time. And so we wanted to, before coming back to the decision of like, hey, do we like this enough that from a governance perspective, we want to start utilizing this moving forward? We want to confirm that the opposite is true, that it doesn't flag an error and it can successfully check if the code is part of the nominated value set in this way. So just ahead of this call, I made a secondary example, very much like the first, right? It calls out, it's specifically saying I'm adherent to this profile where we said, here's the value set that we require. just like this one did. This was the failure one. And this time we just applied the expected system and the expected code. So I'm gonna run the publisher right now, and then we'll take a look at the outcome and talk about what we want to do next about it. Hopefully it should only take a few minutes. So let me go back here. Okay, so assuming that everything occurs the way that we like it to, do we have a need, like maybe the one other framing thing here, which is we made a decision to try to isolate the topic of modeling from the topic of what is the terminology server and the actual value sets that we'd be putting into the compose include statements, and like intentionally separating them, because I think we can make a decision on, hey, do we like this modeling better independent of what value sets do we end up putting into like the end product. And so while still on the topic of can we improve the modeling from what it is today, do we think that we need to evaluate any of these other options like meaningfully if we feel that option B is successful in both of those types of tests? And we've confirmed through previous discussion that it's a better alternative to the way that we're doing things today. My read on some of these were like this one kind of felt like more of a compromise, right? This one was basically saying, well, we'll give up on the ability to like actually, you know, have this kind of pass through, and we'll effectively point to whatever the source of truth will be and provide some type of human readable thing. We liked option B because it gave us the human readable landing page and gave us the ability to point to wherever the source of truth will be. Option 2, basically, I think this one was like required someone who was implementing to like perform additional steps to ignore the stub, which we didn't really like because that's a compromise on our users. And then option 3 was basically just living with the fact that we would just point directly to the source of truth and live without any type of like human indicator, any type of thing that would provide folks an understanding if they clicked on the link itself and they didn't get directly to like a value set landing page. Do we like any of those enough that we think it's worth considering them before making a decision? If B works. I can't tell if you guys are quiet or just in general unanimously feeling like if this works, it's kind of the best of both worlds.
So let me just toss out a couple of considerations. Anywhere that we make reference to an InfoWay value setter code system, it's somehow going to need to be loaded into your validator or your production system in order to be able to validate against. So we aren't going to, and some of these approaches that link directly to the InfoWay value set doesn't provide any additional information with one, whether that's option it's like 1 or 2 or 3, 1A or 2 or 3, they all are trying to go directly to the InfoWay value setter code system. So the IG publication will have errors in it because we can't access that. But that doesn't mean that somebody who's doing conformance testing necessarily doesn't have access to it. With 1B, we at least have that value set, that one level of indirection that lets us say, well, this is what would be in this value set. But it doesn't actually provide the content again, because it's going to try and go out to InfoWay or trying to get that InfoWay value set.
Whether or not it's loaded locally or they can find it on the terminology server.
Right.
No.
There is an advantage to 1B, which is that if at some point we decided that we actually wanted additional terminology in there, we want doctor as well as nurse, but InfoWay decides not to add doctor to their list, we could have our compose another code system or value set into it.
Mm-hmm.
So our value set, healthcare, our value set doesn't change. The baseline
This one,
right.
we don't have to change this URL because we would just modify this to have another inclusion.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Which I guess there's pros and cons to that. But that's where I think you get into value set versioning. And so you could say, well, the old definition of the value set only had nurse in it, whereas the new one has nurse or doctor. So I'm not sure that I'm necessarily arguing for one or the other, or one of the four, but these are considerations around it.
And so, like, to me, they do seem like all pros in this direction. But let me just see if this is, I mean, I hate to, it looks like it did build. I'd hate to kind of come to a conclusion and then find out it doesn't actually do what we're looking for. So I'm just gonna go to the output file and just see, and like let folks kind of chew on it, because I would like us to kind of at least be able to kind of come to a conclusion about whether or not we want to make a change or not. So this is my local build. I'm just going to look at the actual QA report. So our QA reports, this is the one that was the negative one we made before. And it looks like this is the one. Perfect. Okay. Let me just see if that's, yep, this is the test example. So the good news is effectively when it's supposed to error, it errors with that structure, and when it's supposed to not error, it doesn't error. It validates against the profile and finds effectively no issue that has been broken. And so to me, we can just double check this again. Yeah, this is the one that the code, yeah, NERS was expected. To me, this basically says this is operating the way that we desire.
Can you go to the profile?
Yes. So the profile it's validating against is this. It says general, but it's
It's your customized one.
Yeah, so it's this URL. And this was the one we were just looking at in the JSON.
Okay, and if we go into that,
it is import all. We'll look at the JSON together too.
that's interesting. So it's not expanding that.
Not expanding, but it is capable of determining it. Like something is happening when the example is being evaluated, where it is actually going into find role class nurse.
Right. And it's able to find world-class nurse because it is a HL7 value set.
Yep.
That's on the terminology server, the HL7 terminology server.
Yep.
Okay. Yep.
So the only thing that I'm not sure about this, and I don't know if it actually comes up in this consideration, is like the SNOMED piece. And I think we have to like temporarily withhold, like knowing that this allows us to essentially say, if I can target a server, my pass-through works. I think we have to evaluate the decision about that independently, because I don't think whether or not that's a PanCan or a SNOMED server or THO changes our opinion about the modeling.
Sure, then.
Mhm.
So this is really coming in handy because just recently.
Sorry, Finney, will you, you're just a little quiet.
Oh, can you hear me?
That's
clearly?
better.
No? Okay. Yeah, this is really coming in handy because just this morning, or was it yesterday? Anyhow, we've received a notification from one of the vendors that's testing the PSAB and notified that the practitioner role specialty is not, the link is broken in code because obviously it's in the terminology server and they may not necessarily be signed on and they're not hitting it. So is that already going to be addressed by this, or is there another already approach to deal with that?
So my understanding, because we did talk about this scenario specifically last time, is that the modeling will not necessarily fix that directly. The availability of that on a terminology server is what will fix that directly. But the modeling will help insulate against confusion if the vendor is just trying to essentially read about what the expectation is and wants essentially a link to find more information about it.
Right. So that's the minimum, right? If they cannot hit the server, doesn't show the enumeration of the value set, at least it would say something that
Yes.
either you need to be signed on to terminology server, or you could grab it from terminology server. It's also so that's already addressed somewhere.
So the second part is like part of I would say it, like from a practitioner or specialty perspective, it hasn't been addressed, but it is part of what we've been discussing over the last couple of weeks. So what I would like to do, especially because Elliot, I think you had said you might not be able to stay the whole time, is if we can, from a governance perspective, I'd like to be able to determine whether or not we're ready for a decision about like the modeling. And then we can talk about, well, what server do we point to and what value sets go where, just for like separation of concerns. Does anyone have a concern with us like making that decision now now that we've evaluated this, we've looked at it from a profiling governance perspective, like we're comfortable making a motion or a decision about a swap in our modeling in the next minor or major release?
What's the impact of this to, well, I guess it's not going to impact any of the existing patient sub PSCA specs that are leveraging the baseline. But what's kind of the implication going forward for guides that implement baseline?
So the impact, so if, for instance, let me think about this. If you are just pointing, like PSCA points to, I think it's like practitioner role directly, because it doesn't necessarily like change anything about it. It just says, follow this. The value set housed within it would obviously update to a new canonical URL, but it wouldn't impact the actual value expectations, and it wouldn't impact like the reference to that practitioner profile. If you're reprofiling, I'm trying to think of like, I think most of our bindings are preferred. And so I think even a canonical change wouldn't impact somebody who had like stated a different value set on top of it. I'm trying to think if there's like any other lenses to think about impact from a profiling perspective there. One maybe human impact would be people might believe that by changing the canonical URL that we are now like that the content itself has changed, not just the modeling. And so that is something we'd have to consider to basically say, oh, well, if another profile points to the direct source of truth and the baseline has this like intermediary baseline value set URL, if you don't click in and you aren't like evaluating it more than superficially, you might think, oh, well, these are out of alignment with each other.
It wouldn't change instances that are compliant because the code systems that get used in the end are the same ones. So a value, you've still got nurse is still out of the same code system. And so it would still be valid, and a value other than nurse would still not be valid, regardless of how it was modeled.
Yes, because the validation is the concept within the code system. The value set is a packaging and publication and reference thing. Now, having the solution where we have a baseline value set that is then composed and points to, let's just say, the InfoWay value set, does that help the challenge that some people have had with loading both the terminology gateway in the past, terminology gateway list of value sets, and then the baseline, and having duplicates and overlaps and those kinds of things because of the way we did stub value sets? Does this help fix that problem?
It should fix the problem of essentially having two packages with two value set definitions that have the same canonical that have different information in them. So it solves that problem directly because we will have changed it will be seen as something that is unique.
Any of the solutions on the previous page would
Yes.
solve that, right?
Yep. How real do we think this thing is? I mean, like, I guess what we're trying to kind of weigh this against is this is the only solution on that other page that, like, the downside is this kind of superficial, like, potential for like a superficial perception, whereas the other ones, the downside is just more directly like, well, everything appears aligned, but it also superficially makes people believe it doesn't work. And my opinion is that I think that from a perception standpoint, the belief that this thing doesn't work is maybe worse than the belief that if I click into it and I actually read about it, I can find out it's not misaligned. Maybe that is the better of two bads in terms of a perception thing. So, like, do folks feel similarly or differently about that?
Yeah, I think I agree. I mean, it's easy for us looking at this stuff every week to say, oh, it's obvious that this is working, even though it looks like it's not working. For somebody who comes in without that level of experience, it's like, oh, it's broken. I'm just going to abandon it. Seems natural.
Yeah, we definitely like, we repeatedly used to get that, that complaint. Is there anything else that we think that we need to evaluate in terms of an impact before making a decision?
I don't know, but there may be issues around versioning where if we directly include the value set, it gets pinned to a specific version in the IG. But if we include it by reference, unless we've got a version on the canonical reference, then it could be free floating. So whatever is the latest version of that value set. I need to think this through, and I'm not sure that there's an obvious winner of whether it's fixed or floating. You know, we've updated the value set. You should be paying attention to the updated value set. You've updated the value set. You've broken what was previously working. I don't know which is better. But I'd have to think it through to see if there was a difference in terms of one of those modeling approaches.
Yeah, and that question, it's very much like the question we used to ask when we were building CDA implementation guides around whether we were binding to a value set statically, as in that specific version, or binding dynamically, as in we want the most current up-to-date version of the value set. And we don't really have that concept in FHIR. But that's sort of what we're talking about here. And the right answer varies a lot on the specific binding, right? Certainly we can bind to a specific value set version in FHIR where we want to. I think by default, it's assuming that the binding is dynamic. It's the current version of that value set unless you otherwise specified.
And that's how we've done our value set stubs to date.
Yes, and for the most part, particularly for things like clinical value sets and things like LOINC and things, that's what we want. Sometimes when we're talking about structural value sets and things, in rare cases, I can see that we'd want to bind to a specific value set. But I think that's not the most common case and something we'd want to do explicitly in our binding, if that's what we needed.
So, Elliot, is the versioning an independent decision? Like, I would think that what do we do about versioning is applies to any of these options.
I think it does. I just need to think it through and perhaps play with it a little bit to be sure. If the reason that you are getting a particular version of an HL7 value set is because you've declared that you use FHIR release 4, and FHIR release 4 is bound to a specific release of the terminology, then it gives you one result. But if the terminology is being brought in through some other route, it may pick up the more recent version of that terminology. So I don't know this. I s- it may be that one of these options has one behavior and then another of these options will have another behavior.
Do you think it's reasonable? So we want to invest. So basically what I've said is independent of option. I think we have to option like selection. Maybe across all options. Is it reasonable to think, okay, if we need to kind of take some time and chew on this, and Elliot, if it was something that you wanted to play around with, to try to say, okay, well, for the next profiling call, we'll see where we can get with the goal of making the decision on the profiling call? Or do we think we need more time?
Yeah, I can try and poke around at it for the next call.
Let me just highlight, this is kind of where we left off. Okay. Yeah, and like if we're not to the point where, yeah, we feel super confident, I think that, you know, it's, if we don't intend for it to go out in the minor release, then we have a little bit more time, but it would be nice to kind of close this one out, because what we do know is that
Could be.
we don't have a good option in place today.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I will kind of tag this for where it's at right now. And I'm gonna jump to the second part, which was like, last time we were kind of mixing and matching like well, if we wanted to test this, but if we want to test it with the PanCan server, how would we do that? And what we determined was, you know, when we were trying to test it last time, we confirmed, well, it had an authentication aspect. The PanCan server had an authentication aspect in place. And so we couldn't complete our testing, but it kind of triggered the discussion around, okay, if for instance, we had to deal with authentication, or we had to kind of pass any of the information using the IG Publisher tool, what options might we have? And I think you had started a chat, or no, it's actually here on chat.fire.org. Elliot, you had posted like, you know, a bit of a conversation on chat.fire.org about how this often works, and would like offered kind of to talk a little bit about like some of the challenges and the things that you kind of ran into, right?
Yeah. So the basic issue is we tried pointing at the InfoWay terminology server as a parameter to the IG publisher using the TX option. And we were getting errors back because we weren't authenticated. I started playing around with the terminology server, realized it's using OAuth, and was able to set up a proxy on my machine and configure the terminology server. So instead of pointing directly at the InfoWay terminology server, I was able to point at my local machine proxy.
This, right?
Yeah. And have that proxy add in the necessary authentication headers to pass to the InfoWay terminology server. It's a little challenging to do that because you need to the headers. Your token only lasts for 30 minutes. And then you need to re-authenticate and get a new one. Yeah, where it says your bearer token, right on the second last line. And you can do that. You can get that using Postman relatively easily. and there's a Postman collection for talking to the InfoWay terminology server. So it is possible to do that. What I ran into at that point was that if I tell IG Publisher to talk to the InfoWay terminology server, it will only talk to the InfoWay terminology server. And anything else, it can't resolve those value sets. So any of the HL7 value sets that get used in any of our resources, it can't find. So it turns out that that's not actually a great solution. I was very hopeful when I got that script working, and then I went, oh no, that doesn't work. So yeah, that's not a solution. The ideal solution, I think, is to get the HL7 terminology, or sorry, get the InfoWay terminology server registered with InfoWay, or with, let me try this again. Get the InfoWay terminology server registered with HL7, because there is a mechanism to fan out terminology queries to whoever might happen to have that information.
And that would that resolve the issue of, like, if it was an HL7 value set for, let's say, status, clinical status, that THO could then be checked for clinical status, and a value set as it relates to practitioner specialty within that structure, the PanCan terminology server would also be checked.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think the other alternative would be to run a clone of THO in your local environment. That might be an organizational terminology server, or it might be just one running in a Docker container on your own machine, and also load into it the InfoWay terminology. And that would be a way to get both of those sets of information on the same terminology server.
Just want to point out that we had this discussion somewhere before, but that option 4 really isn't the ideal scenario, because the issue becomes everybody who has, like we have the Alberta server, we have to register the Alberta server up there. And then we have to make sure that when we use the Alberta server, that if we put a call into some other set, that we make sure that that global server points to the InfoWay one as the next choice, for example. And then whichever one after that is the next choice if it's not found, rather than we wouldn't want to hit this global one and then suddenly start pulling up the South African list of terms for some value set that's not matching ours, right? So, or on the other side of it, you start having to register thousands of servers up there that has got to sort through to figure out which one to actually go to.
I suspect Graham would be very happy to have a problem of there being thousands of terminology servers out there. But so
until it happened, I think.
Yeah.
But that's the challenge, is if we put it up there, it means everybody has to register their server there. And it's better, the better solution in my mind is we can register like our local server, which handles most stuff, and anything that is that HL7 level or whatever level up, we can pass up there. And so then you do get maybe the national servers registered up there, but you don't want regional ones.
Well, I think unless you use the fan out, so my understanding, and Elliot, correct me if I'm wrong, is that if you aren't using a fan out option, then let's say you have a local terminology server and you want that to be hit. If you don't use fan out infrastructure, you have to load everything from the HL7 like value sets, as well as anything from the national value sets into your server, your local
Right,
one,
that's
which I
the
think is the
problem.
worst problem.
But see, that's what I think is the problem right now, is because whichever you can only point to one server, and therefore that one server has to handle everything, rather than be able to point to, your local server and then the fallback one, which then goes to like the international one to look for where to find it.
Well, I think that's what FHIR is attempting to communicate, is that like this, as I understand it, is the only option where if we're like, there will probably be context and logic to what servers are prioritized. But my understanding is this is the only option to get more than one server in play.
Right, and
Is
that's what
that your
I think that
understanding?
tool needs to be changed to handle more than one. And that was my suggestion.
Yeah. Although that's not exactly in our control, at least in the short term.
No, that's true.
Right.
But I think that's what our really ideal goal is, to get the server to handle more than one.
So let me just play with this for a bit. At least in the Canadian context, I can't imagine. I'm going to speak for the Infoway people on the call here. I can't imagine that they would object to Alberta putting their terminology on the Infoway server. So
Actually, we talked to Anil about that.
Yeah, we've already been told that we can't do that.
We can't.
okay. All right. I'm wrong then. I'm sorry. Okay,
No,
so
just
then so the next option would be for you to run your own terminology server, which is a copy of HL7s, and use its fan out mechanism. You'd have to configure it. Well, you have to configure it differently?
That gets really ugly because, because we'd want it to hit the Alberta, then the Canada, then HL7. Now, well, ideally, if Canada's registered in HL7, then we just Alberta in the HL7, and it goes.
Well, and that, your local terminology server could have the Alberta content in it. It doesn't need
Correct.
to actually fan out to a separate
Right,
terminology
it only needs to do
server.
that for the stuff that's not Alberta based. So if we're using an Infoway terminology set, we'd want to go hit there, because we're not going to make a copy of that for Alberta.
Right.
Ideally.
Yeah.
That's what this is, right? Like this is
Right.
the black box.
So
where
that's what I'm
we
saying,
assume
so-
some contextual logic is in place with this option.
And so that's why you need to be able to point to, like, we don't want to hit just that international server to try and find all our local stuff. We want to hit our local stuff and then go to the international if we don't have it locally.
Yeah, so under the existing the way that Graham has structured things, you would have to point to a local terminology server.
It's a complete copy.
Well, I think you could probably thin it down from being a complete copy, but I don't know how to do that. And I don't know that Graham knows how to do that, but it should be possible.
Well,
I think.
by complete copy, I mean a complete copy of all the terms that you're actually interested in. So you wouldn't truly need a complete copy.
That is true. But what would be nice to do would be to use the THO terminology server, ideally configured only with your own local terminology and with the fan out instructions.
Correct.
So if it's not your local terminology, it knows to go to HL7 or to Infoway for what it needs.
Isn't that
Right.
determined by the canonical URL of the value sets in the conformance profiles that you're evaluating against though? Like it's
It
either,
is.
Yes and no.
Okay.
Can you go to tx.fire.org?
Yeah.
Okay. And the last entry there is TX reg. And so if we scroll down a little bit, this is the locations that the central terminology server knows that it can go query. It can query the FHIR R4 terminology, it can query the FHIR R3 terminology, and it can query Australian terminology. And in there, it has, you see where it says HL7-OU or AU.test. It says authoritative for the following. And so if you are asking for either the Australian SNOMED or for any code system that follows this format, or if you ask for any value sets that are underneath healthterminologies.gov.au, it will end up going to the Australian one as the authoritative source. tx.fire.org, up on the third line of that table, we can see is authoritative for anything coming from hl7.org or terminology.hl7.org. It also will, I believe, if it can't find an authoritative source for a value set or code system, it will ask any of those servers if they've got it. So if there's somebody saying, "Oh, I'm not the official way you're supposed to get LOINC, but I'll give it to you. I can give it to you anyhow." That's what would happen. So, if we had HL7 Canada or Infoway listed here, we could set it up as authoritative for certain content and not other.
and the same for, if you had an AB value set and an AB local server, the same logic could be present, right?
So if you have a local server, it's going to check the local server first, I believe. And so Alberta wouldn't need to be registered in this fan out. I don't think, or at least wouldn't
somebody
need
else to see it.
Pardon me?
So unless you wanted somebody outside of Alberta to go see it.
Yeah, unless you wanted somebody outside of who's got direct access to the Alberta terminology server. Yeah.
Okay, so let me just. So we expect that local server will be hit first. And that independently, there is the ability to claim authoritative sources for like national and global servers. Like this. That would deal essentially with, that would inform where and out to after hitting the local. Like this is an assumption, so I'm trying to phrase it like we expect.
That's how I think it will work. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Randy, that is more desirable for you than when we first started talk. Like, does that resolve some of the concerns that you had?
Well, this is what I think is the ideal target, is to get it here like this rather than just everybody registering at that top level. Because this makes the load on that top level less.
Well, so
performing local server, right?
my understanding of what happens is that tx.fire.org will go and just query the servers that are registered with it. Will query them for what code systems and value sets do you have? Just give me the canonicals. And it can be configured to do that on some schedule. But when it comes to actually asking for the content of the value sets and code systems, or for validating against them, that ends up going to the local server, or going to whatever server can provide that value set.
Yeah, whichever registered server has it.
Yeah. So you're not putting a huge load on, say, the Infoway server, except, because all that's happening is every, I don't know whether it's once a day or once an hour or once every 5 minutes, checking, hey, what value sets do you have? And then when somebody runs Publisher and tries to make use of a Infoway value set, that's the only time the Infoway server would get hit to do the validation or the expansion or something like that.
But I think all good assumptions to validate. I'm
Yeah.
gonna save where we're at. And I think we can always come back to this as like a kind of future topic, especially if that chat thread continues to evolve. I think it's a good place for us to assess those assumptions and then kind of come back and say, well, are we seeing it evolve in such a way that our assumptions are correct? And come back to on the next governance call about that. Does that sound like a good next steps and takeaway?
Sure.
All right, I will stop the recording and I will see you folks next Friday for our profiling call, where we will return back to that versioning value set question and apply some of our issues from the issue log that you guys worked through with Mike last session. Thanks so much, folks.